Well, thanks for coming along. It's good to see you all. That's the title of our talk today. I hope that's what you expected. I'll explain as well just who we are. I'm Mike Farley. I'm from Woodgate & Clark Loss Adjusters, accompanied today by my colleague Darren, who's a proper loss adjuster as opposed to myself, and actually goes and deals with claims. And also David Reed Rowland of Hawkins, who are very clever people who go out and find out what's actually gone on when we appoint them on claims. So hopefully today that's what you've come to see. And in all these cases we come up with learning objectives. So these are the things hopefully you'll take away from today. And hopefully there's a sort of something there which will be of use to you. So I'll do the loss adjusting bit, if I may, and just a little bit of background information as to what we are and what we do. So we are independent claims specialists, and we have our own chartered body, Chartered Institute of Loss Adjusters, formed in 1941, and got our Royal Charter in 1961. Not a huge organisation in the sense of members, 4,500 members or so at the present time, mainly UK. There are some that are abroad as well, but that is our main body. And hanging up in our main office is this very nice charter. And I just picked out a couple of things here that I think are of relevance to us and what we do. We should, of course, behave in a professional way, behave ethically, with integrity, be objective in all judgments, act impartially, and also act with courtesy and consideration. So that's the background to what we do. So when we how do we progress things, and how do we make a living? Well, we are appointed on claims by insurers or their appointed representatives, and of course they can be MGAs, they can be brokers, they can be whoever has got the authority to do so. And over the years, it's true to say, we went out on site all the time. We go and visit site and undertake investigations. Nowadays, some companies, mine included, undertake internal claim handling as well, and have a facility to do that, which is fine, and obviously going within the market requirements. And there's also a number of affiliated services as well. Now, there are a number of things. Surveying, we have surveyors on our staff, and we provide that. People provide valuation services as well. Risk management came along very much so in the 1980s, and it's something that a lot of people do. Also surveillance work, that's very interesting. Our special investigation people get involved in that. So there's a number of different services that are on offer. So when we receive a claim, we need to give consideration to all of the people that are interested, and often there's an absolute myriad of different parties that we need to deal with. I started out in insurance claims in the 1980s dealing with domestic claims, and there was always simply an insured and an insurance company. It doesn't quite work like that in the loss adjusting world, in the commercial side. Obviously we have an insured party, but there could be loads of other people: leaseholders, tenants, brokers, of course, sub-brokers, managing agents, loss assessors acting on behalf of the insured as well. Lots of different parties, and our role is basically to make sure that everyone is kept in the loop and the right people are involved in the claim. And this triage process, we always have to progress with claims in a speedy manner in accordance with the set SLAs, service level agreements, that we all adhere to. But crucially, I would stress this, we do go on a claim immediately, drop everything if there's an urgent loss comes in. Darren will nod here, he does this quite a lot. He's picked upon by us to go out on the claim. But it's the exciting part of what we do, and once you've done adjusting, you actually get quite excited by that sort of work. So what we thought we'd do today, rather than just telling you what we do in theory, is tell you about something that actually happened in practice. And on the basis that I have the man who dealt with the claim here, Darren, and the gentleman who was appointed to get involved as well, we thought that it would be quite helpful. So we have, just to set the scene, a case involving a residential property owner's policy. Relatively straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary with that, we thought. a few things I'd just like you to bear in mind here. The date of loss we put up there, that's of relevance, as you'll see later on. And the fact this claim came in, there were no initial concerns about this. This happens every day. We had a look at it. It came in with quotes, photographs. We did realise it was quite large. We have to stress that. We're not dealing with a simple case for a couple of £1,000. It was obviously quite big, but we thought, OK, no problem. Made various contacts, and Darren went on site. So, on site, first thing to note here, the named policyholder wasn't present. There are some things that you sort of get to know as an adjuster that slightly cause you concern, and that's something that we'd always say is a little bit of a concern to us. We always try and meet the person who's party to the contract and who is entitled to the claim. Or, of course, a member from the organisation that's covered many commercial policies as well, and there were people that are quite able to deal with that claim. But it's just something that we thought was a slight area of concern. So this is one of two sons of the named insured. We won't go into names or any other details, but represented by members of family. And we were told this was an escape of water from the loft. That's nothing unusual. 80% of residential property owner claims at least are escapes of water. I'm sure most people will say it could be 90, bane of our lives to a degree, or people's lives, but there we go. And the reserve, we won't go into great detail how that was established, but £75,000 reserve, again, genuine reserve, put on the claim and put on there and we are very much aware of the importance of reserves. It's relevant to stress this. It's one of the most difficult parts of a loss adjuster's job. I always refer to a situation many years ago when I was relatively green around the ears going out on a claim and asked a surveyor who was on site. I don't know why he was there, but I said, "How much do you think this is worth?" And he sort of looked at me in a state of amazement. He said, "Well, I don't know. It depends on, depends what the market will say when we get the tenders back, and we'll work it out from there." And that, to me, said it all. We usually, of course, you bide your time, make inquiries, find out how bad it is. But we're actually expected to give an accurate reserve within a very short space of time. And it's a difficult thing to do. And thankfully, we do get it right most of the time, but it is very hard work. So that was our initial inquiry. And so, as we said, on the face of it, all appears to be very straightforward. The risk address, detached house, quality estate. But crucial things here, unoccupied at the time of the loss and at the time of our visit. And it had been previously tenanted as a private let. We were told it had been vacant for 2 weeks. And again, that's of specific relevance. So with all this limited detail available, and the attending brother of the insured being extremely vague, although he also told us, I believe, he hadn't actually inspected and seen the damage himself, first of all, we started to get a little bit concerned. And of course, my colleague here did a little bit of detective work, just generally looked around, and we'll show you some photographs in a moment of this property. There were a few things that started to cause a bit of concern. Place is empty, paint samples on the wall. I think Darren's suggesting it might have been they were looking at the ways to revamp the property in the future, and this was something that they were sort of, just seemed a bit odd. Indentations on the carpet, and there's a little bits of foil on the wall. And this was the thing that we thought was quite interesting, sort of holes in the ceiling that had actually been filled in, but clearly holes in the ceiling. Now, we won't sort of beat around the bush here. We had an immediate thought this property is being used for the farming of cannabis. Absolutely certain about that. And we know about this simply because we've come across them a lot. And my colleague David here, I think he's going to make some comment about how you grow the stuff, but not that I know anything about that at all. This was indeed, we felt, used as a cannabis farm, and I thought I'd just throw this information in there. Of course, one cannabis farm is found every 2 days. Apparently there's a prevalence in South London. I'm a North Londoner, I couldn't comment, but I have to say there are certainly more helicopters flying around in the winter than I happen to see normally in the past, and of course they look for heat from having to grow this stuff. But as you can see here, it's quite a significant issue, and there is a link between violence, drugs and modern slavery, so it's something to take very seriously around. But anyway, back to our claim. I don't know how... Oh, you can see that quite well there. You'll see here, these are Darren's photographs taken on the day. And something was not right. You can say it doesn't take a sort of a genius to work that out immediately. On the photograph looking to the left as it's on the screen, we have these two holes that have been clumsily cut out and then sort of filled in again. And we also have these indentations on the carpet. And they were used, we think, to actually have the very heavy buckets, as it were, to put the earth in, the stuff to actually grow the plants. And we've got some more issues here. You can see the foil on the left-hand side on the wall, which clumsy really, not taking that away, but there we are. And you can also see that those paint samples on the wall to the left-hand, to the right-hand side. Interestingly, there you can actually tell there's been water damage to this property. We must stress the water damage was there. It was absolutely clear that a loss had occurred. So, very odd, very odd. Now, I don't know how many people who have of a certain age, I remember this, but we refer to these as our Columbo moments now, the detective of that name of many years ago, and you start asking questions, well, I'm not quite sure why, why was this and whatever. And I have to say, to Darren's credit, noted in the property, lying about, I understand, post-noted on the property addressed to the Sun, which was a document from the bailiff, no doubt. Basically, again, Darren explained this a bit later on, didn't look too good. Also, no tenancy agreement available. Immediately starts to raise suspicions. If this place had been used 2 weeks beforehand, why was there no tenancy agreement? And we do these standard background checks. Most people do them. We certainly do them. All of our claims. They're not difficult. Just find out whether or not things are in order. And as you can see, we obtained a CCJ, which is a county court judgment, details which was discovered against a charge against the property from HM Revenue, another warning sign. And now of interest to this was then we also spoke with the managing agents. We spoke about managing agents earlier on being important, one of the many people involved in the chain here. And the managing agents were quite happy to try and confirm the insured's tale. So clearly we felt there was some collusion here going on from the start, and they confirmed that they'd met the outgoing tenant and taken possession of the keys. Now bear in mind here that that would have been on the 30th of April. We had the loss on the 14th of May. We were extremely dubious to that, because if the property was being used as we thought it would be, it certainly was no way it could have been a 2-week period that this damage was actually concerned, which is what the first matter here says. And so that was the concern we had. So our cause of concern was that the cause was escape of water from a tank. We didn't initially have a plumber's invoice. No invoice for the work was offered, and alarm bells ring. So the sensible thing to do there, of course, for us is to make further inquiries, and that's exactly what we did, and we appointed a forensic consultant. And now David is going to tell us about all the work that he did to take this further forward. So, David, I'll hand over to you and put your first slide on there.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come today. I'm just going to introduce Hawkins very briefly. We're a forensic engineering company providing a wide range of investigation services, both domestically and internationally. Primarily to the insurance and legal sectors, but increasingly to corporate clients and manufacturers. We've got 8 offices in the UK, 3 overseas, and about 100 investigators spread amongst those offices. And our role is really to provide technical answers to help our clients, yourselves, understand the problems that you're having. It might be in relation to policy repudiation or recovery, or identifying fraud, or helping a manufacturer identify product defects. Our opinions are always independent. Our role is primarily to the court to provide independent expert witness if things ever go that far. So these are just some of the areas of work we get involved in. Our fire investigators look at the causes of fires, which might be electrical faults, arsons, things like that. We've got a team of fire engineers, which is a slightly different discipline, and what they do is consider how the design and construction of a building and the management and service has been carried out, and whether any sort of poor management, poor design has caused the fire to spread in ways that it shouldn't have. We've got mechanical and materials engineers. They look at broken bits of metal, essentially, escapes of water, and that sort of thing. Our chemists and chemical engineers look at personal injuries like poisoning incidents, contamination of foodstuffs and pharmaceutical products, smoke damage to building and stock, and failures of chemical processes and environmental damage. We've got quite a well-established electrical engineering team, and they look at things like electric shocks, electrocutions, and failure of electrical plant. Moving up the scale, we've got a power generation team, and they look at sort of the power stations, the wind farms, and the distribution networks associated with them. We've got a team of highways and civil engineers. They look essentially at big things which don't move and have gone wrong. So building collapses, landslips, that sort of thing. We've also got some experts in hydrology who look at large-scale flooding incidents, and their sort of remit is to consider whether a flood is caused because of unusual weather conditions or just poor maintenance of drains. We also do, very quickly, traffic accidents. We've got a marine and shipping team, and they look at cargo fires, damage to cargo, that sort of thing. So moving quickly back to the case that Mike has introduced, it was obvious that there's been a fairly extensive water leak at the property, and he's alluded to sort of things which looked a bit suspicious, like the paint marks on the walls, circular marks on the floors, and the holes cut through the ceilings. And all these, as he said, gave rise to a suspicion that perhaps cannabis was being grown here. The one thing he didn't discuss is in the bottom image there, you can see there's quite a lot of mold on the wall. That's a classic indication of a cannabis factory, because it's very humid, and sort of mold flourishes in those conditions. So I'll take a step sideways and just discuss how you go about growing cannabis. This is all entirely theoretical, I must add. On a basic level, the plants need warmth, light, water, soil, and nutrients to grow. It's important in urban contexts that the factories are discreet and not identified by neighbours or authorities. And actually the plants grow quicker inside because you can control the growing conditions so much better. You can change the length of the day, change the temperature, change the humidity to suit the kind of plant that you're growing, but also the phase of the plant's life. Artificial light is provided by those very big lights. They give out an awful lot of heat, which is quite obvious in winter. You can see what the neighbour's been up to. But they also use a huge amount of electricity. And in order to make these operations more profitable, the operators will quite often tap into the electricity cables and bypass the meter. They're incredibly brave. I honestly wouldn't like to try and cut my way into that and connect things up. The electrical work is almost always fairly shoddy. You can see in the bottom image there's sort of timers and extension leads and wires going everywhere. And that sort of thing really increases the risk of fire quite significantly. In addition to all this lot, they need ventilation, and the ventilation brings in carbon dioxide from the outside to help the plants grow. That ventilation normally comprises fans and ducts and things like that, which pass through holes which have been cut in floors and walls, and that sort of thing. The cannabis plants, when they're actually growing, produce quite an identifiable and specific odour. So the ventilation system is often fitted with carbon filters just to reduce the amount that they pump out. Coming back to the property, there's obviously all the telltale signs that arose the suspicion in the first place. We had a look at the electricity supply equipment. There was no evidence that it had been tampered with. But when we looked at the gas bills and the electricity bills, the electricity consumption was spectacularly high, which is another sort of indication that we might be on the right track. The water leak in this case had come, as Mike said, from the water tank in the loft. Now, this is the sort of traditional arrangement that you'll have in older houses. Newer houses are different. But basically, the mains water supply will come into the tank, keep it filled up, and when you draw water out, the tank sort of refills. And what there is in the tank, if you looked at the left-hand image there, there's a float arm which rests on the water. And when you draw the water out, the float arm comes down, opens a valve, lets more water in and fills the tank up. The tank's also got an overflow pipe, and the design, the intention of this is if the valve fails to close properly, water will get carried by that overflow pipe and be discharged outside your house. And if you've ever wondered what the white pipe sticking out the side of your wall is, that's probably what it is. And if it's dripping, call a plumber. We reconnected the water supply just to find out what had caused the leak, and simulated the tank being full by holding the float arm up. And even when it was in that position, water continued to flow in. So there was obviously something wrong with it. The other thing we found was that the overflow pipe had been broken where it comes out of the tank, and had been bent nearby. So there's two sort of independent factors, two independent observations which we've found, which have both been responsible for this leak. So just to describe briefly how the valves work, on the left-hand side you'll see a float arm which pivots up and down with the water as it fills and empties. That float arm pushes up against the piston. That piston pushes up against the rubber diaphragm. And when the tank is full, the float arm pushes on the piston pushes on the diaphragm pushes against the seat inside the valve, and that stops more water coming in. All very simple. When you empty your tank, the opposite happens. So we had a look at the valve from this particular property. And first of all, we found that the diaphragm had been cut and damaged. But secondly, the most significant observation was that the valve seat had been rotated and put in the wrong way around. You can see in the top image there, sorry, the bottom image is how it should be. And that had basically been turned around so the valve couldn't operate. And that must have been done intentionally. There's just simply no way that these things turn around themselves. The question, I suppose, is could that valve seat always have been the wrong way around? No, for two reasons. Firstly, it would never work, so that it would have been a problem before. But secondly, there was all sorts of lime scale marks on the parts which showed at some stage, and for most of the lifetime of this thing, it had been the right way around. So it must have been rotated recently. The other question to address was why the overflow had broken. We'd discounted anything to do with freezing weather conditions, material defects, degradation, that sort of thing. We looked at the fracture surfaces. They weren't covered in any sort of debris. They're nice and clean, which indicates quite strongly that they'd been broken quite recently. So we've got two things which have happened quite recently, both of which have been responsible for the leak. And essentially putting those together, the inescapable conclusion is that somebody had caused this water leak deliberately. I'm going to hand over to Darren now, who's going to pick up the next bit of the investigation.
Thanks, David. Now, I was tasked with visiting this particular property, and as Mike said, it was a property which was on a very, very expensive estate, not particularly one that you could probably arrive at and be overly concerned about. It wasn't the best house on the estate by any means, but it wasn't the worst either. So no particular reason to think there was anything amiss as such. But obviously, as David's pointed out, we did later establish that something deliberate had occurred. So although it was on the face of it like most of other claims, I met with the policyholder's son, and obviously after looking around the property, observed the damage that we saw earlier in the photos, water damage, fairly straightforward, nothing particularly amiss from that point of view. The evidence of the cannabis factory, pretty evident. Now the son was pretty vague on the circumstances, which obviously always gives a bit of a ground to suspect that there might be something amiss. As Mike said, the property had been unoccupied for several weeks. We had this damage in the first floor of the property in terms of the cannabis factory, which had been cleared up. He, of course, didn't seem to know anything about any of the events or anything, hadn't noticed it. I didn't actually make a big thing of it at the time. Frankly, I find it's often better to just walk away having established some brief facts and then go away and investigate, hence David's later involvement. So we had the marks on the carpet, the paint samples, but obviously there were concerns. There was no evidence that anybody had broken into the property, which might have been another thought. Had somebody got into the property and perhaps made a cannabis factory that the policyholder wasn't aware of. So we'd ruled that out. In fact, I think although David didn't mention it, forensics also looked at that and confirmed that there was no evidence anywhere that anybody had got into the property. Now, the policyholder's son had said that he'd had little involvement. His brother, who was away overseas, had been more involved, and there was also a managing agent who had been dealing with matters as far as the property was concerned. So, as Mike alluded to earlier, we always do background inquiries on policyholders and other parties that might be of interest, and that included in this instance the policyholder's son, who'd obviously been involved to some extent. Now, in terms of background inquiries, we have a special investigator that will often do a lot of that sort of work anyway, and we'll find county court judgments, insolvencies, bankruptcies, most things that you probably wouldn't want us to find out, really. Now, it transpired that the son, very nice that he was, who arrived in a very nice Bentley at the property, was in fact a bankrupt. So obviously more alarm bells about him. So we've obviously got forensics involved at that point, and we've come to the point where we know it's deliberately caused. We also have the county court judgments, which Mike's referred to now. Obviously some insurers will make a thing of a county court judgment depending on what they were told at inception, others won't. Everyone seems to get different answers depending on where you're dealing with. But in any event, this particular insurer wasn't going to take any action on the county court judgment, so therefore, as far as they were concerned, the policy was a valid policy, it was in force, and therefore there was no prospect of voidance. We were effectively looking at a way of not dealing with the claim, frankly, based on what we knew so far. So we've got the policy as accepted at the time of in force at the time of loss, but we had to consider how did all this come about and whether it related to the previous occupancy. In other words, was there involvement of the tenant, the managing agent, policyholder, the son, or whoever, really. Now, coming to the possibility. Obviously, when you do go to a property like this, you're fairly quickly thinking about where things might lead, who might be involved, what avenues of investigation you might need to go through, and obviously where you think that might end up, I suppose, in a way, the sort of end goal. Now, we knew the water escape was deliberate. We had to consider, obviously, who was involved, and we knew there was a cannabis factory at the property. So, frankly, my initial thought was that probably somebody had decided, having had the cannabis damage, perhaps they weren't convinced that would be covered, albeit they probably were wrong in this case, and perhaps decided, having put some paint samples on the wall and thought about how much it might cost them to redecorate, perhaps there was a way round that, and hence the water escape idea, which obviously somebody was fairly clever at manufacturing, although obviously not clever enough for David from that point of view. So the obvious candidate in terms of the cannabis factory might have been the tenant. You know, quite often the case, you know, landlord lets out property, quite often gets paid in cash, thinks it's wonderful because the tenant pays on time every month, never causes a problem, never has any noise complaints, is the perfect tenant. Well, obviously he doesn't want to be discovered, so he's clearly going to be the perfect tenant. So we had that as a possibility, but we also had the managing agent for the property saying that the tenant had vacated on the 30th of April. So that seemed slightly odd, and on the face of it rules out the tenant. Now, the tenant apparently had left the property with the managing agent middle of May. He'd handed back the keys. The managing agent had met him at the property. The keys were handed over. The managing agent looked round the property. There was no problem, no damage, nothing amiss whatsoever. So on the 30th of April, it was all perfect, apparently. But obviously not when I went, which was a couple of weeks later. So we've got, in a sense, the managing agent saying that it therefore couldn't be the tenant, and there was no possibility of that being the case. And we've also got the son who, albeit being vague, had periodically checked the property, confirmed that it had been secure whenever he turned up to have a little look, and again he was aware of nothing at all amiss, no damage. Obviously we didn't particularly tell them what we were looking at, but they were convinced that there was no problem. So no one else had been in the property. Now, we've established that there is obviously a cannabis factory has occurred at the property, but we also know that it's completely impossible to establish a cannabis factory, grow the plants, harvest the crop, and take all the equipment away in 2 weeks. Well, unless David can tell me otherwise, but I'm fairly convinced it's a much longer process. Not that I'd know. So the version of events that we were given is blatantly not true. So obviously we've got to try and draw this matter a bit further forward. And it occurred to me that obviously with the investigations also proving that there was perhaps a business relationship between the managing agent and the son, that there may be collusion between the two. There was certainly evidence of various companies with connections, shall we say, and obviously the son being apparently a bankrupt, we also rather thought that there might have been some reason for him to be involved in propagation of cannabis. I'm sure you have to pay for his Bentley somehow. In terms of documenting the events, really what we had to do next was try to get to the point where we are pinning people down, and that's where we come to the interview. So what we were trying to do here, in conjunction with our special investigator, was essentially get everybody involved to confirm exactly what they'd already told us, really. So we asked the managing agent and the policyholder's son to attend an interview, a recorded interview, and in essence just asked them to tell us pretty much what they'd already told us, so that everybody was completely clear that that was absolutely what had happened, dates, times, people, etc. And we made that happen obviously with them both there at the same time, so there was no sort of possible collusion later or working out of stories, etc. Now, we'd been asked at this point for the forensic evidence because clearly they were aware that David's was involved and that there'd been an investigation into the cause. And they also knew we were asking questions of plumbers, etc., etc. So they weren't obviously entirely unawares that we were looking at it. And we advised that the forensic report could be provided to them once the interview had been given, obviously with insurer's approval. So we were quite happy to disclose the full facts that David had found. So obviously at this point the individuals are not aware that we know it's deliberate. They've obviously presumably got some suspicions that we have a concern, I would have thought, because this had certainly taken a few weeks to get to this point. We went through the recorded interview process. In effect, as we sort of expected them to do, they backed each other's story up 100%. And effectively boxed themselves into a corner in doing so. So they've ruled out any potential involvement of the tenant, who I think, to be honest with you, probably did more likely deal with the cannabis there, although of course the son may have been involved given his bailiff issues. We couldn't prove that, but in any event. So we had them both confirm a frankly implausible set of circumstances, which is where we lead to obviously what happens after that interview. So we had committed to providing them a copy of that forensic report, and we'd also said that we would give them a copy of the recorded statement, recorded interview, and certainly that was what we did. So of course at that point both the managing agent and the son become fairly quickly aware that the conclusion of David's report is that the water leak was deliberate. Of course, by that point they were, as I said before, boxed into the circumstances and not really able to, frankly, slide out of what they'd already told us. Now, we left it with the managing agent and son that we would have to go back to insurers and see what they wished us to do, and seek their instructions. And we then obtained their views in terms of potential repudiation, which isn't always as straightforward as it might seem. Fortunately, the policy did not cover, as you can see, illegal or deliberate acts by the insured, in fact the insured's family or employees, and there was also an exclusion for fraud by the insured or anyone acting on their behalf. So we'd already concluded, having looked at this, well, certainly some time before this actually, where this might be going, that would enable us to repudiate the claim. And the insurer sought legal advice before actually doing so. But ultimately, that was exactly what occurred. The claim was repudiated, and interestingly enough, no contact was ever received from any of the parties again. They disappeared. Unfortunately, we'd seen them off, so to speak. Now that, I think, probably concludes everything from our perspective. But obviously, we're happy to answer any questions if you've got any. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Any awkward questions for us? Please do ask.
Hi there, Kevin Petty from RSA. On the basis, the assumption that cannabis farming is illegal, when or at what stage would you consider involving the police?
It's a good question. To be honest, we do. You deal with this more than I do, Darren, but we do let police authorities know. But I think the harsh reality is the police are less than interested, which is a sort of indictment we have, I'm afraid. Am I right? Is that the
Yeah. To be honest with you, I don't think you'd by and large, you wouldn't get any positive response from the police in those circumstances. I'm sure both David and myself are probably thinking of one particular claim, not involving cannabis, where we had a circumstance where we had somebody on CCTV running out of a building that had been set on fire with 2 other people, very close proximity, and despite all of the evidence pointing to the fact that this particular individual had been involved in the blaze, who was the policyholder, the police decided to take no further action. So, you know, even when there was a possible charge of arson with intent to endanger life, which I think carries at least 10 years, it might even carry life, I'm not sure, but they decided that there wasn't enough evidence. We had detailed discussions with them, so I think that sort of answers the question from that point of view. They just aren't interested.
It should be borne in mind as well, actually, the people tend to be caught are just probably that we were saying earlier on, the modern slavery type, you know, the people that are sort of pushed into doing this, and not the big dealers who would actually, as charged, would stick against. So it's a difficult area, but yeah, unfortunately they don't seem to take much interest.
The majority of cannabis factories that I've dealt with have been fires, where the fire brigade will have attended. They will have discovered the plantation and called the police. So we often get involved after the police have already been and taken all the equipment away.
If I understood you correctly, you seem to indicate that the insurers did not want to take any point on coverage relating to the fact of the cannabis factory itself. Is that right? And although you're not the insurers, can you explain why they took that view?
Well, I think that the reality was there was no evidence of these guys' involvement, only we just simply had a circumstance. We're dealing with an escape of water loss. That's what's been presented to us. We've proved that that was evidently a deliberate water escape, and I think that the broad brush of it was that was felt to be the avenue to pursue down in terms of repudiating the claim.
And if I may, a very quick supplementary question. For the benefit of the unenlightened, what's the significance of the bits of foil on the wall?
I should have mentioned, what they usually do is line the walls and the windows with insulation to stop heat getting out, and foil to reflect the light back in, so you make best use of the light.
A quick one for me, if I may. Obviously, Darren, I'm going to come to you on this one. The policy does not cover illegal or deliberate acts by the insured or the insured's family or employees. What's the situation if there was a mortgage?
Well, there's a good question. I think in reality there wasn't in this case, so we didn't get to that point. I think that would be a case of over to the lawyers, to be honest.
I don't think it would obviously change matters, but you're right. I think if there was a large outstanding loan and a large bank or building society behind there, they might have a different view. But in theory, it wouldn't change. It shouldn't make any difference.
Any lawyers in the room want to have a word about that? Because I seem to recall back in my youth there was a case of a particular claim. It wasn't fraud, it was basically just not covered because they had not done something that they said they would do.
Yeah.
And I think there was a Lloyd's syndicate and that panned the mortgage company out, obviously less than the actual property.
Yeah.
There's a question here.
Hi there. I was just wondering, obviously no further action was taken against the insured in this case in terms of taking them to court for fraud or anything. Obviously this investigation did incur costs. How were the costs just not recovered, or?
I'm afraid so, yes. It's just a fact of dealing with the claim. It's the costs are all part of that. And again, I'd say that declining the claim was the way forward here, wasn't it? And pursuing the policyholder then for any costs it's rare actually that would occur. Certainly as far as I'm aware. So I think again you have to bear in mind there's costs involved in that. There's no certainty of any comeback, and of course there is potentially some bad publicity as well. So that's just the way things are. But no, it rarely happens.
Hi there. I'm assuming that the policy was not renewed. Yeah.
To be honest, I haven't a clue. Do we know?
Yeah. And secondly, I mean, presumably the follow-up would be that they have to disclose they've been refused insurance as well for any subsequent policies.
Yes, they should be. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Just out of curiosity, it wasn't actually the policyholder; it was the son of the policyholder. So who would get declined for insurance in future, the son or the policyholder?
That's a good point. Well, let's make the point that it wasn't the policyholder who was that we established was at wrong here, in the sense we didn't actually meet with her. I mean, I think the answer to that is we can't really answer that as loss adjusters. What was interesting in this case was the fact that we never met the policyholder, and we weren't able to establish and prove that the policyholder had actually done anything wrong. But legal opinion was obtained, and again, Darren knows better than me here, but legal opinion was obtained to establish that it was in order to decline the claim on the basis it was likely that it was members of family who had done wrong, and hence that exclusion applied. And it's a very good point, and I mean, you know, the cynical part of us, and I'm afraid you do get a bit cynical being an adjuster at times, is that, you know, you find that it's just as likely that they'd get through and get further cover in the future. It's a fact of life, I'm afraid, but we're pretty robust at trying to find out these things going forward, so hopefully, you know, that their sins would find them out. But yeah, that's the more interesting part, I think, was the technical issue there.
Looking at it from a complaints point of view, we're quite aware of the Financial Ombudsman Service's view on how high the bar is when it comes to fraud. Do you take into account, when you're investigating, do you take any previous FOS rulings into account on cases that you may have seen before?
I think, Susan, the main issue there would be, yes, absolutely. It would be the insurers who would take that into account when deciding whether to, you know, decline a claim or to look at it. We're aware of that as adjusters, but and we would always make reference to that in reports if we felt that was appropriate. But the main decision would again be down to insurers. And I have to say, on this case, I mean, obviously we know who the insurers are, but we were very impressed that they did run with this and took it further because the evidence was there, and they made, I think, a bold decision, and it was the right one. So, and again, within all the relevant guidelines, etc. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all. I think have we reached our zenith on questions?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll call it to a close. Thank you very much for your attention. Colleagues will obviously stay around. There'll probably be some more sandwiches outside and some drinks if you want to stay and have a chat. But would you again please give your appreciation to our colleagues on the day?